This is perhaps the most striking image of a train ascending a mountain imaginable. And I assure you, this image has not been altered. You see, cog railways, also called rack railways, were built to climb mountains using a unique toothed rack rail. The Mount Washington Cog Railway in New Hampshire was the first to use this technology in the United States. There are also currently about 50 rack railways throughout the world. Today, we discover how these mountain climbing trains came to be. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. The first rack railway and the world's oldest continuously running rack railway is the Middleton Railway in Hunslet, England. It was built in 1812 over the route of an existing horse-drawn wagonway that delivered coal from Middleton to Leeds. The colliery manager John Blenkinsop believed that a locomotive that was light enough not to break the tracks would not provide sufficient traction to pull the heavy coal wagons up the gradients on the line. His solution was a track rail with rack teeth on the outer side. This would mesh with a cog wheel on the locomotive. Blenkinsop went on to patent this idea. Essentially, he thought that the friction would be too low from the metal wheels on metal rails, so he created installations that placed the rack rails halfway between the running rails and mounted it on the same ties. He built his trains for the Middleton Railway with a 20-tooth, 3-foot diameter cog wheel on the left side that engaged the rack teeth, 2 teeth per foot on the outside of the rail, the metal fish belly edge rail with its side rack being cast all in one piece, in 3-foot lengths. His system remained in use for 25 years on the Middleton Railway, but it quickly became a global curiosity. Later in 1861 came Sylvester Marsh, who grew up in Compton, New Hampshire. Marsh was born on September the 30th, 1803, and when he was just 19, he walked the 150-mile distance to Boston to seek a job in just 3 days. From there, he worked on a farm, then returned home for a short time, and then again went to Boston, where he entered the provision business. After 7 years, he moved to Chicago, then a young town with a modest population, where he began shipping beef and pork to the East Coast as he developed into a founder of the meatpacking industry in the Midwestern city. At that time, Marsh became very wealthy, but lost his entire fortune in the business panic of 1850. The entrepreneur would ultimately gain back his wealth in the grain business, more specifically producing breakfast cereal. Well, on a trip in 1852, he and a friend went to Mount Washington to climb the peak. His experience wasn't a good one. He almost failed to reach the summit and sheltered due to a storm. Even though his trip wasn't the best, he acknowledged its tourism potential. In particular, he was moved by the spectacular scenery from the tallest slope. This got Marshall thinking. When he returned to his hotel, he conceived an idea for a train service to bring tourists up the mountain, and Marsh followed through on his idea, creating the Mount Washington Cog Railway, a feat so impressive that for the first time, 2 national engineering societies combined their conclusion to designate the train system as a National Historic Mechanical and Civil Engineering landmark. Still, initially, his idea was thought of as insane. Marsh's idea was different. Rollers would be set as rungs between 2 L-shaped rails, gripped by a cog in the center of the axle. Therefore, Marsh's idea consisted of a practical rack where the teeth take the form of rollers arranged like the rungs of a ladder between 2 L-shaped iron rails. The pinion wheels, or cog wheels, on the locomotive have deep teeth that ensure that at least 2 teeth are engaged with the rack at all times. This measure helps reduce the possibilities of pinions riding up and out of the rack. Needless to say, Marsh also put a patent to his technology. The first public trial of the Marsh rack on Mount Washington was made on August the 29th, 1866, when only 1/4 of a mile of track had been completed. But it was enough. The theory proved feasible, and the Mount Washington Railway opened to the public on August the 14th, 1868. The Mount Washington Railway Company, also known as the Cog Railway or simply the Cog, was chartered by the New Hampshire state legislature in 1858 at the request of Marsh. The charter allowed him 5 years to build his railroad. And although Marsh had the means to build this railroad himself, he knew that the success of his endeavor required the support of local railroads to bring the passengers needed. You see, the site of his railway was 26 miles from the nearest railroad station in Littleton. So Marsh began lobbying the railroad men of New England to gain their financial support. And it would be a challenging conquest, starting with John E. Leon, president of the Boston, Concord, and Montreal Railroad. Leon initially was uninterested and considered Marsh a, quote, crazy man. With time and an agreement that Marsh would demonstrate the practicality and safety of his railway at his own expense, Leon and other railroad men agreed to consider the idea. Building a mountain railway was no small task. Equipment and materials had to be hauled by ox for 25 miles to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and then another 6 miles through thick forest to the base of Mount Washington. Building the extremely steep railroad and almost 3 miles of sturdy wooden trestles was a fantastic accomplishment. Interestingly, the railroad does not scale the entire mountain, but begins a quarter up, with grades reaching incredible levels, peaking at 36.6%. The mountain itself afforded views of up to 130 miles in any direction. One can even see New York State and Canada on a very clear day. By the spring of 1858, Marsh decided the railway was ready for testing, and by 1867, 1 mile was prepared for service. Then, once finally completed, the railway attracted admirers and tourists from far and wide. On July the 3rd, 1869, the first train reached the summit of Mount Washington, and the Cog Railway became the first mountain climbing railway in the world. Another interesting fact is that the Mount Washington Cog Railway line reached Jacob's Ladder. This point is significant for 2 reasons. First is because it roughly marked the timber line, and second is that it is the railroad's most impressive segment, both from a visual and engineering standpoint. Jacob's Ladder is the steepest component, with a gradient of 36.6%. The train climbs 1 foot for about every 3 feet of distance. To put this into perspective, in railroad terms, this is entirely impractical. A 3% grade, along with a traditional right-of-way, is considered quite steep, something that no traditional train could scale. Jacob's Ladder was about 200 feet long, with a wooden trestle that rose nearly 30 feet above the mountain once initially completed. However, the 1938 New England hurricane devastated the region and dealt considerable damage to the railroad, including the destruction of Jacob's Ladder. Once rebuilt, this section came out to be 325 feet long, with the trestle rising 20 feet above the mountain. The unique Mount Washington Cog Railway has not only been a popular tourist attraction since the late 1860s, but has also been extensively covered in the media. At the time of its construction, no one believed such technology was conceivable, and many newspaper reports verified that notion. For example, in the Trains magazine article entitled "Geared to the Mountains," authors Lincoln Warren and H.S. Walker noted the summit contained 126 different species of subarctic plants and 63 arctic plants, making this area too cold to construct some particular machine that could travel up the mountains, naysaying that Marsh ultimately proved wrong. At the top of Mount Washington, a museum features lovely old photographs of the construction in the early years, a full-sized mock-up of a locomotive cab and boiler, an actual locomotive frame complete with a driving mechanism, and a section from the railway coach. One of the most popular exhibits is the reproduction of a devil's shingle, a homemade slide board that workers used to descend the mountain after work rapidly. Made of wood and hand-forged iron, the slide board fits over the cog rack and has enough room for a worker and his tools. And although we know this to be a pragmatic solution also used in mines to arrive to work faster, you have to wonder if there was any element of fun in its execution. With what some engineering circles consider to be the greatest engineering feat of the century, it's no wonder why they wanted to create a second cog train in the United States. The Broadmoor, Manitou, and Pikes Peak Cog Railway climbs the 8.9 miles to the 14,110-foot summit of Pikes Peak, Colorado. The railway is the highest in North America and was built as a tourist attraction in the late 19th century. Zelman G. Simmons, a New York-born inventor and founder of the Simmons Beautyrest Mattress Company, started the railway. In 1888, Simmons traveled to Colorado Springs to inspect telegraph insulators on the side of Pikes Peak. When it took 2 miserable days to scale the peak by mule, he decided to finance the construction of the cog railway. Well, at the top of the mountain, Simmons was in awe of the scenery, but determined that the view should be experienced by more civilized and comfortable means. Luckily, the Pikes Peak Railway Company began track construction right away. Pushing a passenger train up a 14,000-foot mountain is no easy task. The first trains used were steam locomotives, designed by Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia. These trains had heavily tilted boilers to keep them level on the average 16% grade up the mountain. The railway had 3 steam locomotives named John Halbert, Manitou, and Pikes Peak, which were later changed to engines 1, 2, and 3. These engines were not coupled to the coach. They simply pushed the train car up the mountain and slowed it during the descent. Each steam engine had to be filled with water 3 times during the ascent, once at the beginning, halfway up, and then finally before the 25% grade point called Big Hill. Finally, the trains were ready to go, and on the afternoon of June the 30th, 1891, a church choir from Denver boarded the first passenger train to the summit of Pikes Peak. Ironically, this was the second attempt. A previously scheduled group of dignitaries had to turn back earlier because of a rock slide at around 12,000 feet. Surprisingly, tourism didn't begin to increase until the early 1960s, obviously raising business concerns from day one. Supposedly, after losing money for years, Simmons sold the railway to a local hotel owner named Spencer Penrose for a reported $50,000. All the way back in 1925. And it seems they were not hesitant to experiment. For example, a gasoline train car, believed to be the first of its kind globally, was installed in 1938. And by 1958, the only steam locomotives still in use on these tracks served to plow snow at the summit. By 1964, the railway needed more locomotives, and for the first time in its 66-year history, the owners went abroad for new rail cars. So in late 1964, Swiss Locomotive and Machine Works delivered 2 red rail cars to Colorado. These locomotives were so successful that the works produced 2 more in 1968. As visitors grew during the 1970s, the railway added 2 semi-permanently connected rail cars built by Swiss Locomotive and Machine Works. This type of rail car was split in the middle, allowing it to make tighter turns on its track. The railway also constructed passing routes in several places along the mountainside. Initially, trains could only pass at the Mountain View siding, which allowed just 3 trains per day to travel up the mountain. With more passing areas, the railway can now send up 8 trains per day. Since its inception, the Manitou and Pikes Peak Cog Railway has taken thousands of tourists from the base station at 7,400 feet up to the Summit House at 14,110 feet. As of 2014, all 4 Swiss locomotives and Machine Works original rail cars were still in operation, although maintenance is an ongoing battle. For example, in the spring season of 2018, they decided not to reopen following a significant infrastructure and equipment evaluation. In a way, the lack of practicality in these trains is part of their charm. Overall, they have always been limited to 2.5 miles per hour, with trips lasting somewhere around 75 minutes for the payoff of an epic view. In my opinion, they're worthy of their national landmark status for the sheer audacity alone. An audacity I'm sure you noticed at the beginning of this video when we examined a picture of a steam train charging directly up a mountain. Thanks for watching, everyone. Until next time, this is Ryan Socash signing